Sorrow of War. The Sorrow of War Vietnamese, Noi Buon Chien Tran is The Sorrow of War. The Sorrow of War Vietnamese, Noi Buon Chien Tran is a 1991 novel by the Vietnamese writer Bao Ninh. The novel was Ninh's graduation project at the Nguyen Du Writing School in Hanoi. 1. It tells the story of a soldier who is collecting dead bodies after the war and then begins to think about his past. The novel won the Independent Foreign Fiction Prize. The novel was banned until 2006 by the Communist Party of Vietnam. Bao Ninh achieved prominence in Hanoi with the first version of the novel, Then Phan Cua Tinu English, The Destiny Identity of Love, published on a Roneo duplicator 3, similar to a mimeograph, before 1990. Soon afterwards Phan Ton Hao translated it into English and took the manuscript to the British publishers Secker and Warburg. Geoffrey Mulligan, an editor there, commissioned Frank Palmos, an Australian journalist who had reported on the Vietnam War and written about it in his book Ridding the Devils 1990, to write an English version based on the raw translation. Citation needed. Bao Ninh had read Phan Ton Hao's Vietnamese translation of Ridding the Devils and willingly agreed to this suggestion. After several meetings with both the author and the translator, Hao, in Hanoi, and journeys throughout Vietnam to check details, Palmos wrote the English version over 7 months in secret in his home in Warwick, a suburb of Perth, Western Australia. It was published in 1994 under the title The Sorrow of War. Counterfeits of the English version became widely available in Vietnam, aimed at the tourist trade. Counterfeit sales have reportedly far exceeded sales of the original edition. In November 2017, the Book Distributors Guild of Vietnam named the English version of Sorrow as the biggest-selling Vietnamese book in the country's history. In 2006, 15 years after its publication, the ban on the book was lifted, and the English edition appeared across bookshops and newsstands in Vietnam. The Sorrow of War was then published in Vietnamese, under the title Noi Buon Chien Tran. Citation needed. It has since been translated into 14 other languages, most from the Palmos English version. The versions directly translated from the Vietnamese include the French version by Phan Huy Duong in 1994, the Japanese version by Okawa Hitoshi, Da Chuan Jun in 1999-4, and the Chinese version by Xia Lu in 2019. 5. The Sorrow of War, written in the stream of consciousness style, 6 opens with a depiction of soldiers on a post-war mission to collect the bones of fallen comrades for reburial. Thus begins the nonlinear narrative by Kien, a North Vietnamese soldier during the Vietnam War, chronicling his loss of innocence, his love, and his anguish at the memories of war. Kien rides in the truck searching for the remains of fallen soldiers in what he imagines is the jungle of screaming souls, and recalls that this is where the 27th Battalion was obliterated except for a handful of survivors. His flashbacks tie the novel together. The theme of these flashbacks centers around the love between Kien and his childhood sweetheart, Phuong. Kien writes a novel about it, then tries to burn it. A mute girl whom Kien sees when drunk, to whom he pours out his thoughts, obtains the text after his departure. Kien, in the book, reflects on his experiences, on the many unacknowledged sacrifices, such as Hua giving up her life to save Kien and his comrades from American soldiers, and acts of immorality and desecration, such as the objectification and treatment of a dead woman in the airport. The novel climaxes with Kien's reflections on his first personal kill, which occurs after he witnesses Phuong's rape. The novel ends with a passage by a new narrator, who explains that he received Kien's novel from the mute girl. Michael Fathers of The Independent noted how both American and Vietnamese cultural depictions of the Vietnam War had tended to be full of romanticization and stereotyping, and wrote, "The sorrow of war soars above all this. It moves backwards and forwards in time, and in and out of despair, dragging you down as the hero loner leads you through his private hell in the highlands of central Vietnam, or pulling you up when his spirits rise. It is a fine war novel and a marvelous book." 7. Hoang Apuong, also known by the pen name Bao Ninh, born the 18th of October 1952, is a Vietnamese novelist, essayist and writer of short stories, best known for his first novel, published in English as The Sorrow of War. 1. Ninh recounted that American bombing raids during the Vietnam War, beginning in 1965 when he was 12 to 13, destroyed ordinary people's homes and upended their lives. Ninh stated that his own school in Hanoi was relocated as a result of the bombing, which inspired him to anger rather than fear. 2-3 Ninh stated that Americans entering Vietnam were viewed as no different from earlier French colonizers, and that he inherited this view himself from his parents. 2. During the war, Ninh served in the glorious 27th Youth Brigade, joining when he was 17 years old. 2. He stated that the Vietnamese people who fought against the Americans were not specifically fighting for Marxism, but rather fighting to bring peace for their country. 2. Hunger was a frequent problem for Ninh and his fellow soldiers, who often moved back and forth from their homes to the battlefields. Of the 500 who went to war with the brigade in 1969, Ninh is one of 10 who survived. Ninh described the fear caused among Vietnamese soldiers by American airpower while in combat during the war. While the bombs were falling, only a stone wouldn't be terrified. If the Americans noticed movement in the forest, they would eliminate the forest. Who knows how much money was spent? American taxpayer is money. If a cluster of napalm bombs were dropped, the jungle would turn into a sea of fire. Can you imagine a sea of fire? Bayonin 2. Ninh later called the war fratricide, fueled by American firepower. In war, no one wins or loses. There is only destruction. 3. The British author-photographer Tim Page and others have compared the novel favorably to Eric Maria Remarque's All Quiet on the Western Front. The British newspaper The Independent judged The Sorrow of War the best foreign book of 1994. The prize money was equally shared by the author, Bao Ninh, the translator, Phan Ton Hao, and Frank Palmos, the author of the English version for publication. In 2010, the British Society of Authors listed the translation as one of the best 50 translations of the previous century. Bao Ninh is a Vietnamese writer born on October 18, 1952, in Hanoi. He served as a soldier in the glorious 27th Youth Brigade during the Vietnam War, and he came back home as one of only 10 survivors in his unit of 500. The war had an immense impact on Ninh's life, and the only possible way he could cope with the terror was to write. The initial title of Ninh's debut novel was Then Phan Cua Tin Yu, The Destiny of Love, which tells the story of a young man named Keen, a veteran whose job is to dispose of leftover bodies after the Vietnam War. As he continues to work, Keen endures flashbacks to the horror of battle as well as the abuse he suffered in his childhood. Ninh's book is a brutal, harrowing story that addresses the mental repercussions of war and strongly reflects his personal experiences as a soldier. Then Phan Cua Tin Yu first circulated Hanoi in a Roneo form and became popular in Vietnam. Phan Ton Ho translated it into English, which led the Communist Party in Vietnam to ban the novel. The English-language manuscript was most likely smuggled out and, now titled The Sorrow of War, was published in 1994 to great acclaim. It was a bestseller in the West and still remained popular in Vietnam in the form of pirated, contraband copies. The ban was lifted in 2006. Upon its publication in English, The Sorrow of War garnered positive reviews from audiences and critics alike for its provocative portrayal of a war that took the lives of over 1 million people. Michael Fathers of The Independent praises Ninh for the multi-layered nature of the story and how it explores the impact of the war on every facet of the protagonist. He states that, on one level it is a love story. On another it is about a writer, a burnt-out case, finding his way. It is also about camaraderie and lost innocence and class conflict. It moves backwards and forwards in time, and in and out of despair, dragging you down as the hero loner leads you through his private hell in the highlands of central Vietnam or pulling you up when his spirits rise. The masterful storytelling throughout The Sorrow of War ultimately led to its winning the Independent Foreign Fiction Prize. Of the novel, writer Viet Thanh Nguyen writes, linear, coherent storytelling in regards to the war and the revolution are the features of government-sanctioned storytelling, in films, novels, and especially historical museums. This kind of storytelling pins all the blame on enemy outsiders and internal traitors, and paints the soldiers, guerrillas, and revolutionaries as optimistic, noble patriots. Bao Ninh's novel tells a radically different story about how these young patriots were utterly destroyed by the war. That much is coherent. But when one is utterly destroyed, can one be coherent? That core trauma is ultimately revealed by the end, and we finally understand why the novel could not be narrated in a linear fashion. This is a terrific move by a novelist who understands, implicitly or explicitly, how trauma works. The Sorrow of War Summary. Keen, a young soldier from Hanoi, has become part of the missing in action team in the year after the Vietnam War. He is tasked with the cleanup and treatment of the bodies and remains of bodies in the jungle of screaming souls. In the aftermath of the recently ended war, Keen and his friends attempt to forget the horrors and atrocities they have witnessed, all while literally burying the dead. But Keen is not actually still in 1975. Rather, he has returned to his nearly apocalyptic experiences of trauma for the specific purpose of finishing his novel. It has been decades since the war ended, but Keen can re-experience it all as if he were still there. Keen remembers the horrors of fighting, the senselessness of it all given that peace was hollow and disillusioning, and the devastation the war brought to his community. Friends were killed, survivors were left bereft and uncomprehending. His treasured love, Fuang, was brutally gang-raped at the beginning of the war, a trauma that forever divided her from Keen and doomed their chance for real post-war love. Keen explains that he's not sharing all of this for nothing. He's trying to capture the horror of war because he feels the reader will likely not understand how terrifying it really was. He shares battle stories and writes about the deaths of his loved ones and comrades, even as he hoped when he began the novel that it could be about the post-war period and not the ordeal of the war itself. The novel does prove cathartic for Keen, to some extent. After considerable exposition from Keen, Bao Ninh introduces himself to the reader, explaining that he has been working with Keen, the writer, to finish the novel. Although Keen is departed now, Bao explains, Keen's decision to finally look into his own fractured past yielded a reward for Keen in the final days of his life. He remembered the way things used to feel when they were all naive and innocent, before the war. The Sorrow of War character list. Keen, the protagonist of the novel, which tells his story told in non-chronological flashbacks. A serious, diligent, and cool-headed man, Keen comes from a bourgeois family, though his mother leaves his father and his father becomes a tortured artist. Keen enlists to fight when he is 17 and is excited about the opportunity, though he is sad to leave his cherished girlfriend, Fuang. War perverts and nearly destroys Keen, who marvels at all the terrible things he sees and does. He is a sorrowful man, and this characteristic is noted by those around him. His post-war life is marked by loss and disillusionment, as Fuang leaves him twice and he cannot escape from his memories of the war. Eventually, he begins a novel, which allows him to partially exorcise his demons and more fully engage in the pre-war past, the only period of his life that is filled with joy and peace. Tran Sun, the truck driver for the Mia unit. He tells Keen that he is visited by the dead, who tell him things. He's very pessimistic and finds no solace in the war's end, nor in its purported goal of making life better. Fuang, Keen's teenage love, a beautiful, spirited, passionate, dreamy soul who is attracted to the glamour of the war and seems destined for a painful and sorrowful life. She follows Keen into the first moments of war. After their train is bombed, she ends up being gang-raped by several men. Though we only see her through Keen's eyes, it is clear she is changed by this event and considers herself doomed. She and Keen do not connect for 10 years while he fights. During the time, she engages in prostitution to survive. She and Keen try to make it work once he returns, but it is too difficult. Though Fuang loves him, she tells Keen they cannot be together. Her fate is unknown. Lofty, Tin, one of Keen's men in his platoon. He is killed when the men ambush a group of commandos for murdering the 3 farmhouse girls, one of whom Lofty Tin was sleeping with. Can, Athen, rather annoying soldier who hoped for glory but deserts after finding that he cannot stomach being in the war. Keen is affected by him, as Can comes to him before he leaves to confess what he plans to do. Can never makes it home, and his corpse is discovered only a couple hours away from his departure point. Keen's father, an eccentric artist who was difficult to live with, thus, Keen's mother left him. He eventually withdrew from public life, focusing intensely on his surreal, tortured paintings. He was sorrowful and in ill health, and he died right before Keen went off to war. Keen's mother. Keen has few memories of his mother, mostly photographs. She was a loyal party member and encouraged Keen to be one as well. She left Keen's father and married the poet. Keen did not see her after she left. Keen's stepfather, a pro-war poet for whom Keen's mother left his father. He went into hiding during the days of communist ascendancy due to an anti-intellectual climate. When Keen visited him, he found him dreamy, romantic, and inspiring, though someone rather foreign to himself. His stepfather died a few years later and Keen did not see him again. Lan, the daughter of Mother Lan, who was a maternal figure to the battalion while they trained in the area. Lan lives alone, burdened by the memories of her deceased mother, brothers, and infant son. She tells Keen he always has a place with her if he chooses to return to Doi Mo. Han, a beautiful single girl who lived in Keen's building when he was a teenager. She found him handsome and asked him to help her dig an air raid shelter in her room, but when he tried to kiss her, she put him off. She told him to return because she had something to tell him, but Keen never did, and she soon left without ever telling him her secret. The prostitute. A young, emaciated woman who works as a prostitute in Hanoi. Keen rescues her from an attacker and realizes she is the sister of one of his childhood friends, Vin. Tran Sin. A former classmate of Keen and Fuong, he sustains a spinal injury during the war and rapidly deteriorates. Keen visits him and is overcome by the ruined man. Fan. One of Keen's Mia scouts who obsesses over a dead ARVN soldier whom he'd promised to help but could not. Kwong. Keen's commander, who is brutally injured during the war and begs Keen to kill him. When Keen will not, he blows himself up with a grenade. His maniacal laughter haunts Keen. Own. Keen's fellow soldier, he sympathetically allows a female enemy soldier to retreat, but she shoots him dead. The mute girl. A young woman who lives in Keen's father's attic. She falls in love with Keen even though she knows he does not love her and only wants her to be a sounding board for the stories of his novel. They are intimate once and never see each other again after Keen leaves in the night. He leaves her the apartment and his manuscript. Clumsy, Bong. Avataran, once known for driving an armored car and being hardy and courageous, now, he has been reduced to drunkenness and despair. Heen. A girl soldier whom Keen meets and has a brief flirtation with on the peace train. Hua. A young girl soldier from the north working as a trail guide in Cambodia. Keen ends up with her in a group of wounded men, and he is frustrated that she cannot find the way to South. He softens toward her as they look for the right trail, but she is raped and killed not long after when she sacrifices herself to protect the wounded men from an American patrol. The narrator. Ninh writes a character into the novel at the very end who functions as the novel's fictional creator. Some scholars speculate it is supposed to be Ninh himself. This narrator writes that he came across the manuscript the mute girl possessed, read through it, and copied it. He realized he knew Keen and believed they bore the same fate, the same sorrow of war.